Everyone. Um, Great opportunity to be with colleagues. Some of my bio goes on, but I'm also a recovering banker, Melissa. So a recovering banker who's actually trying to do good in the community. So we're we're totally together on that. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. But I'm very happy to be with Democracy Collaborative. Also here today is Michael Brennan. Raise your hand, Michael, who wrote a great paper on public banking. So ask him about that because I am not a researcher, but I am a practitioner in a lot of areas that I think relate to both public banks and community wealth building. So let's go to the next slide. So let's define, first of all, what are we talking about when we say community wealth building? It is a phrase that is a democracy collaborative, but it's really some good common sense, I think you'll see. So what we're really talking about is an economic development model that transforms local economies based on direct community ownership and control of assets. So the motivation is what? The motivation is local and community ownership of assets because we know where assets go, the community follows, right? So the real goals are to share in economic prosperity. So the key there is that it's just a matter of who gets to share in it, right? Is it just a few at the top or is it more broadly spaced out? And then, of course, we have to always consider racial equity as well as ecological sustainability. So if you live long enough, you've done a little bit of everything, is what I'm finding out in this world, especially if you are of a certain mission-based mindset. So I've had the opportunity to work in the CDFI industry. I've also worked at an anchor institution whose behavior is critical to community wealth building. And then I've also worked with a trade association for community development corporations, which are the local nonprofits that often get to dictate what happens in a community. So today, I'm gonna put back on my CDFI hat because as I understood it, part of this conference is to push us to think differently. So I want us to ask ourselves, what if, I know they can do a lot of things, but what if public banks behave, if they picked that as a way to operate? We're gonna look at what they would do, meaning what are some of the key principles in terms of organizing their work, and then how they would be structured to be successful in that goal. So let's look at the next slide. Well, one of the things that you'll see that would be very different probably as a CDFI is that the strategy would be quite localized. In other words, the bank would not come in with an idea of what to do. The bank would figure out what that particular community needed. I know, for example, in Cleveland, and sometimes that means spreading the wealth from a neighborhood over here that's doing pretty well to one right next to it that's not doing so well. I don't know about the cities you guys live in, but Cleveland, you can go 2 blocks and be in a whole different world, right? So how do you spread that? In Cleveland, for example, we had something called the Greater University Circle Initiative. University Circle is where the big hospitals are, big cultural organizations, as well as a college, a major university. So that area is doing quite well. Right next to it was predominantly African American, underinvested neighborhood called Glenville. So we created an initiative to incentivize people that worked and lived in University Circle to work there to buy houses in Glenville next door, in the shop next door. We actually gave money to help people to do that. And some of the workers, we incentivized the hospitals to hire more workers from right next door. So how do you share what are assets in the region with less prosperous neighborhoods? And then when you look at when you look at challenged neighborhoods, you tend to focus on what? The negatives, right? The liabilities, the poverty, the lack of employment, all these negative things. But what if you turn that around and started to think about the assets in those neighborhoods? For example, in Chicago, um, with Shore Bank, which was the nation's first CDFI, by the way, yay. Um, we created a whole niche of lending to longtime renters in the neighborhood who would be in a building that had maybe 2 or 4 or 6 units, to finance them to purchase those buildings and renovate them, live in one of the units, and then rent out the other as supplemental income for themselves. So now you're creating community wealth with people that have been in the neighborhoods a long time, not folks that came in to displace others. And you're also stabilizing neighborhoods in that way. So looking for the assets and trying to capitalize on those is key. In Cleveland, we had a whole faith-based lending strategy because in a lot of these neighborhoods, churches have been there for decades, if not 100 years. And so there's trust and there's understanding of that neighborhood by those entities. So how do you keep them strong and keep them able to continue to do the good work they're doing in their neighborhoods? Let's go to the next slide. And this is key. In order to do this work effectively, you have to connect to the existing leadership. I mean, the existing community leadership. And that's going to be uneven. You're not going to have, every neighborhood's not going to have a strong leadership base, but many of them do. Because what we have to establish is trust, right? And as a newcomer coming in, believe me, most of these neighborhoods have had promises made, and some have been out, at best, promises made and not kept, and at worst, been outright lied to about what was going to happen in their community. So as a newcomer working in this space, it's very important to create trust by connecting with people that the community already trusts. In Cleveland, we have a very strong community development corporation structure. So every neighborhood has a nonprofit that's just focused on it. There's a connection between that nonprofit back to the city council people. And in many cases, they've operated, for over 100 years in a particular neighborhood. So not only do they know the neighborhood, but the neighborhood trusts them. So when we came in as a bank, as a CDFI, one of the first things we had to do was to understand those CDCs, find out from them what the needs were. Now we're back to building the strategy from the neighborhood up, and then be partners with them, because we didn't want to be seen as competitors. And I heard that before, that in some cases public banks are seen as competitors to other folks in the industry, whereas once the trust is established and everybody's roles are outlined, it's easier to see the collaborative opportunities and not just the competitive nature. We also had strong support from the mayor when we came in. He was a progressive person and actually quite guilty, because the city and the corporate community had just raised this big fund to build new stadiums downtown, right? Which was important because we needed to bring people back to downtown Cleveland. But then the cry came out, well, what are you doing for the neighborhoods, right? That's fine for downtown, but what are you doing for the neighborhood? So we were able to step in as a CDFI and address that, and therefore give the mayor an answer to that question, which politicians like answers to their questions. And we had to work with we wanted to leverage what we had as a smaller institution with a larger institution. So we worked with them. We worked with the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act areas of big banks, to do things like participate loans, so we could do bigger projects that we could do potentially on our own. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the other things, and I'll close here shortly, how would it be structured? Would you put a bank on every corner? Would you try to out-branch the big banks, or would you do something different? In our case, we did something different. Our funding strategy was much more about socially responsible investments. We were one of the earliest people to come up with that notion, this thing called development deposits, where people we would pay them just below market and use those funds to really fund the lending that we were doing in the neighborhood. We were not about to out-branch the big banks. We couldn't have afforded to do that anyway, and that's not what the neighborhoods needed at that time. So look at being creative in terms of how you structure your bank. In terms of lending, we look for opportunities to support what were stable businesses and stable borrowers, but who didn't necessarily look so on paper, right? So to take a next look, so even though you might not have a long paying your rent for the last 20 years, right? So to be creative and who we even sought as borrowers. And then I would want to put one more plug in to say, consider some nonprofit affiliates as well. Banks are banks and banks are regulated, so there's only so far you can go with certain things. We, for example, set up a nonprofit that had some non-bank lending, but also had an enterprise center to try to attract businesses into our neighborhoods and therefore those jobs. And in fact, that's the first time I got to know the Democracy Collaborative, because we were the landlord to a cooperative laundry that got created with the help of the Democracy Collaborative to do business back in University Circle with the hospitals and the other institutions. So, and then finally, governance. We've talked about this a couple times. You need a board that understands both the mission and the business model, right? Either one in overkill will not work. So that needs to be a balanced governance structure. So with that, I will leave you. The last slide just has some contact information if you want to know more about community wealth building. And check that out. This is my contact information, and I really look forward to hearing discussion about whether you think public banks should behave like CDFIs. Thank you.